The rain was a frantic, desperate thing that night, throwing itself against my window panes like it was trying to get in. I was used to the sound. My apartment on the fourth floor was a ship in a storm most of the year, a quiet, orderly vessel navigating the chaos of the city below. It was my sanctuary, the one place where the jagged edges of my own loneliness were sanded smooth by routine. I had my work, my books, the faint hum of the server in the corner. It was enough. Or, at least, I had told myself it was enough for the better part of a decade. The truth was a much sharper, more painful thing I kept locked away. His name was Alex. The doorbell split the night with a shrill, jarring buzz that went straight to my bones. It was almost midnight. No one came to see me at midnight. My world was a 9-to-5 affair, even though I worked from home, a freelance graphic designer whose most exciting collaborations happened over email. I froze, my hand hovering over my mouse, the blue light of the monitor painting my face in sterile hues. The buzz came again, longer this time, insistent. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. It had to be a mistake. A drunk neighbor. A delivery for the wrong apartment. I pushed back from my desk, the wheels of my chair whispering across the hardwood floor. The rain hammered the glass, a frantic percussion accompanying the thudding of my own heart. I peered through the peephole, and the world tilted on its axis. It was him. Alex. Not the Alex I knew, the one with the easy grin and the light in his eyes that could convince you the sun rose just for him. This was a man stripped down to the studs, a hollowed-out version held together by a drenched coat and sheer force of will. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers suddenly clumsy and thick. The moment I opened the door, he practically fell inside, bringing the storm with him. Rainwater streamed from his hair, plastered it to his forehead. His expensive wool coat, the one his wife Melissa had bought him for Christmas, was soaked through, dark and heavy. He was shivering, a fine, violent tremor that seemed to originate from the very center of his being. His eyes, usually a warm, clear hazel, were clouded over, lost. Alex? What's wrong? What happened? My voice was rough and used. He just stood there on my welcome mat, dripping onto the worn fibers, his chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow breaths. The smell of cold rain and something sharper, whiskey, filled my small entryway. He looked at me, but I wasn't sure he was really seeing me. It was like he was looking through me, at some fixed point in a future that had just been obliterated. She's gone, Leo, he finally managed, the words a raw scrape in his throat. Melissa. She left. The sentence hung in the air between us, impossibly heavy. Melissa. Of course. For 12 years, it had always been Alex and Melissa. A package deal. The perfect couple. I was the perpetual third wheel, the quiet, reliable friend who was always there for holiday parties and weekend barbecues, smiling and nodding while the thing I kept locked away screamed inside my chest. Gone? What do you mean, gone? I asked, my mind struggling to catch up. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. Packed her bags. Left a note on the counter. Said she wasn't happy. Hasn't been for years. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Years, Leo? We had dinner last night. We talked about refinishing the deck. And she was already gone. I reached out, my hand hovering near his arm, unsure of the protocol for this level of devastation. I was the friend you called to help move a couch or figure out a tax form. I was not the friend you called when your entire world imploded. He swayed slightly, and that was all the invitation I needed. I grabbed his arm, my grip firm, and pulled him fully inside, kicking the door shut behind him. Come on, I said, my voice softer now. Let's get you out of those wet clothes. He let me lead him into the living room like a child, his steps unsteady. I peeled the heavy coat off his shoulders. It landed on the floor with a wet smack. His shirt underneath was damp, clinging to his chest. The shivers were worse now, racking his entire frame. His teeth were chattering. I didn't know where else to go, he whispered, his gaze fixed on the floor. I drove around for hours. I just ended up here. It's okay. You're here now. You're safe. The words felt flimsy, inadequate against the sheer force of his grief. He finally looked up, and his eyes found mine. They were wrecked. Utterly and completely wrecked. A raw vulnerability pulsed in them, a plea so profound it stole the air from my lungs. This was an Alex I had never seen, never even imagined. The confident architect, the man who could command a room with a single gesture, was gone. In his place was just a man, lost and freezing in the ruins of his life. "Leo," he said, his voice cracking. He took a staggering step closer, his hands coming up to grip the front of my sweatshirt. His knuckles were white. I need. He struggled for the words, his mind clearly a maelstrom of pain and shock. He shook his head again, squeezing his eyes shut as if to block out an image. "Just your arms. I need your arms." Without a second of hesitation, I wrapped my arms around him. He collapsed against me, his full weight sinking into my chest. He was solid, real, and trembling like a leaf. I held him tightly, my chin resting on the top of his damp head. He smelled of the storm, of whiskey, and underneath it all, the familiar, faint scent of his cologne, a scent that had been a quiet torture for me for more than a decade. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, and a shuddering sob tore through him. It was a silent, gut-wrenching sound of pure agony. I just held on, anchoring him. We stood there for a long time, the only sounds the ticking of the clock on the wall and the muffled drumming of the rain. His sobs slowly subsided into ragged breaths against my skin. His grip on my sweatshirt loosened slightly. I thought he was going to pull away, but instead, he just sagged deeper against me, his forehead resting on my shoulder. "And your mouth," he mumbled, his voice thick and distorted by his proximity to my neck and the alcohol. Time stopped. My heart, which had been hammering with concern, now seized with something else entirely. A dangerous, stupid, impossible hope. "Your mouth." Did he say that? Did he mean it? "The man is shattered," my rational brain screamed. "He's drunk and grieving and barely coherent." He probably meant to say voice, or myth, or moth, anything but that. But the secret, hopeful part of me, the part one had starved and suppressed for 12 years, heard it clear as a bell. It latched onto the word, dissecting it, replaying the broken sound of it against my skin. He didn't pull away. He was still pressed against me, his breath warm and damp on my neck. I could feel the faint scrape of his stubble. My entire body is on high alert now. This is a moment of intense internal reflection. The world outside this small circle of our embrace ceases to exist. There is only the weight of him, the scent of him, and that one impossible word. What do I do? What does he want? My mind races through 1,000 scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. If I misinterpret this, if I make a move, I could destroy the one friendship that has been a constant in my adult life. He's my best friend. My straight, married, until an hour ago, best friend. But he asked, or he slurred. I choose to believe he slurred. It's the only safe option. It's the only way to preserve what we have. "You need to talk," I said, my voice miraculously steady. I chose the safest interpretation. "I'm here. I'll listen. All night, if you need me to." He didn't respond immediately. He just took another shaky breath, a long, slow inhale. Then he gave a faint nod against my shoulder. Relief and a sharp, stinging disappointment warred within me. Of course that's what he meant. I was an idiot. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." I gently eased him back, keeping my hands on his arms to steady him. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. The raw vulnerability was still there, but it was joined by a profound weariness. He looked like he could sleep for 100 years. "Let's get you on the couch," I said. "I'll get you some dry clothes." He nodded again, letting me guide him to the worn leather sofa that dominated my living room. He sank into it, his body looking too heavy for his own bones to support. I went to my bedroom and pulled out a soft, threadbare t-shirt and a pair of old sweatpants. When I came back, he hadn't moved. He was just staring at the blank television screen, his hands limp in his lap. I placed the clothes beside him. "Here, these should fit." He looked at them, then back at me. "Thanks, Leo. I'll give you a minute." I turned to leave, to give him a sliver of privacy in the wreckage, but his voice stopped me. "Don't. Please." It was quiet, but laced with a thread of panic. "Don't go." So I stayed. I perched on the edge of the coffee table, my back to him, and listened to the soft sounds of him changing. The rustle of fabric, the soft sigh as he pulled on the dry clothes. It was an intimacy we had never shared, born of crisis. When I heard him settle back into the cushions, I turned around. He was curled on his side, my old gray sweatpants bunching at his ankles, my faded university t-shirt hanging loosely on his frame. He looked smaller somehow, swallowed by my clothes. I grabbed the thick wool blanket from the back of my armchair and unfolded it, draping it over him. His eyes were already closed, dark lashes stark against his pale skin. He looked utterly spent. I tucked the blanket around his shoulders, my fingers brushing against the nape of his neck. His skin was cold. He didn't stir. For the next few days, my apartment became a convalescent home for a broken heart. Alex existed in a kind of suspended animation. He slept on the couch, deep, exhausting sleeps that lasted for 12, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch. When he was awake, he was a ghost haunting my living room, staring out the window at the relentless gray sky or flipping through television channels without ever seeming to register what was on the screen. He barely ate, picking at the food I put in front of him before pushing it away with a mumbled apology. My own life ground to a halt. My design projects sat untouched, client emails went unanswered. My meticulously ordered world had been invaded by a beautiful, chaotic sadness, and I found I couldn't look away. I became an observer, a chronicler of his grief. I watched the way he slept, on his side, one arm tucked under the pillow, the other thrown over his head as if to ward off a blow. I learned the rhythm of his breathing, the low, steady rumble that filled the quiet spaces of my apartment. I noticed the way his brow would furrow in his sleep, the tiny lines of stress that hadn't been there a week ago etched around his eyes. I studied the slope of his shoulders as he sat hunched on the sofa, the curve of his neck. I watched his hands, strong, capable hands that I'd seen draft blueprints and build furniture, as they lay listless in his lap or trembled when he lifted a coffee mug to his lips. I was cataloging him, memorizing this new, broken version of the man I had loved from a safe distance for so long. Having him here, so close and so unguarded, was a unique form of torture. Every instinct I had screamed at me to reach out, to smooth the worry from his forehead, to hold his hand and tell him it would all be okay. But I couldn't. I was his friend, his safe harbor. To do anything more would be to take advantage of his pain, to turn his tragedy into my opportunity. So I watched and I waited, and I brought him coffee he barely drank and food he barely ate. The silence between us was immense. In the past, our conversations had been easy, full of banter and shared jokes. Now, words felt like heavy, breakable things. I would try sometimes, asking gentle questions about his work, about a game he might have watched, but his answers were monosyllabic, his attention always drifting back to some internal, painful landscape I couldn't see. The first shift came about a week into his stay. I was in the kitchen, making toast, when he came to stand in the doorway. He was wearing the same clothes I'd given him the first night. His hair was a mess, and he needed a shave, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Awareness. "I'm sorry, Leo," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. I turned, the toaster popping up with a startling clatter. "For what? You have nothing to be sorry for." "For this," he said, gesturing vaguely at himself, at the couch that had become his bed, at the general state of disarray he had brought into my home. "I've completely taken over your life. You haven't been working. I see the emails piling up." I was stunned that he had noticed. "It's fine, Alex. It can wait. You're more important." The words came out before I could stop them. Too honest, too raw. A strange expression crossed his face. He looked down at his bare feet on my kitchen tiles. "Still, I can't just lie here forever. I feel like I'm turning into a piece of furniture." "You're not," I said softly. "You're grieving." "I'm rotting," he countered, with the first spark of his old self I'd seen. A dark, cynical spark, but a spark nonetheless. He finally met my gaze. "I need to do something. Anything. I'll go insane if I just sit here for one more day." My heart leaped with a cautious optimism. "Okay," I said. "What do you want to do?" He shrugged, a heavy, tired movement. "I don't know. Something physical. Something that doesn't require thinking." He looked around my apartment, his architect's eye scanning the space. His gaze landed on the far wall of the living room, a dull, uninspired beige that I had been meaning to paint for 3 years. "We could paint this place," he said, a hint of an idea taking root. "You've been complaining about this color since you moved in." It was true. We had talked about it countless times, one of those perennial someday projects. "You want to paint?" "Yeah," he said, and for the first time in a week, his voice had a trace of conviction. "I want to watch something change. I want to cover something up." And so, the next day, We went to the hardware store. The trip was surreal. Pushing a cart through the brightly lit aisles, arguing over shades of gray, it was so jarringly normal it felt like we were playing parts in a movie about our own lives. Alex, who could design a skyscraper, was surprisingly decisive about paint colors. He picked a deep, calming charcoal he called Stormy Night. I found the name a bit on the nose, but I didn't argue. The work was a balm. It gave us a shared purpose, a reason to be in the same room without the crushing weight of his divorce filling every silence. We moved furniture, laid down drop cloths, the plastic crinkling under our feet. The apartment, my quiet sanctuary, became a chaotic workspace. The air filled with the sharp, clean scent of latex paint. We worked side by side, a comfortable rhythm falling into place. Alex took to the roller with a focused intensity, methodically covering the bland beige with bold, dark strokes. I followed with a brush, cutting in the edges with careful, precise lines. For hours, the only sounds were the squelch of the roller in the paint tray, the whisper of my brush against the wall, and the soft rock station I'd put on the radio. The physical act of transformation was cathartic. With every stroke, it felt like we were not just changing the color of the walls, but also shifting the emotional atmosphere of the room. The beige of my lonely stasis was being replaced by something deep, complex, and intentional. As we worked, small, incidental touches began to happen. In the cramped space, our shoulders would brush as one of us reached for the paint tray. He'd put a hand on the small of my back to steady himself as he stepped over a pile of drop cloths. "Behind you," he'd murmur, his voice low and close to my ear. Each touch was a tiny spark against the kindling of my long-held feelings. My internal monologue was a frantic mess. That was nothing. He was just moving past you. That was an accident. He needed to steady himself. It means nothing. It means everything. I was a mess of contradictions, my body humming with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with the physical labor. I tried to decipher his expressions, but he was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration. Was he just glad for the distraction, or was he, too, aware of this new, fragile current running between us? I couldn't tell. He was unreadable, a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for half my life. Late in the afternoon on the second day of painting, we were nearly finished. The living room was transformed. The dark gray walls gave the space a sophisticated, intimate feel, making the city lights outside the window seem brighter, more dramatic. We were both splattered with paint, tired, and sweaty. Alex was on a small stepladder, finishing the last high corner, and I was on the floor, touching up a spot on the baseboard. "Hand me that rag, will you?" he asked, not looking down. I picked up a damp cloth and stood, stretching my aching back. I reached up to hand it to him, and as he took it, his fingers brushed against mine. A simple, fleeting contact. But he didn't pull his hand away immediately. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a soft, warm pressure against my own. I looked up, and he was looking down at me. His gaze wasn't one of concentration on his work anymore. It was direct, searching. The air thickened, suddenly charged with all the things we hadn't been saying. The scent of paint and sweat and the faint, lingering smell of his skin filled my senses. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was just a moment. A few seconds suspended in time. Then he blinked, breaking the contact, and turned back to the wall. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. I stepped back, my own hand tingling where he had touched it. It was a meaningful touch. It had to be. It wasn't an accident, not a brush in passing. It was a pause, a question, and I had no idea how to answer it. That night, after we'd cleaned the brushes and collapsed onto the plastic-draped sofa, exhausted, the shared work had broken down some essential barrier between us. We ordered a pizza and ate it straight from the box, the easy silence of shared labor replacing the tense, grief-stricken quiet of the previous week. "It looks good," Alex said, his gaze sweeping over our work. "Really good. You picked the color," I reminded him. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds. My breath caught in my throat. "I have good taste," he said, the old, familiar cockiness returning for a fleeting moment. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the cheesy sitcom on the television providing a low murmur of background noise. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-deep weariness and a sense of shared accomplishment. Then, out of the blue, he turned to me, his expression serious again. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound introspection. "Do you ever feel like you were playing a part, Leo?" he asked, his voice low. "Like you built a whole life you weren't sure you even wanted?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It was so direct, so perceptive, it felt like he had reached into my chest and touched the secret, locked-away thing I had been hiding for years. Was he talking about himself and Melissa? Or was he asking about me? I am playing a part right now, I thought. The part of the supportive, platonic friend who isn't desperately in love with you. I swallowed hard, trying to form a neutral response. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," I hedged. He shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, I mean really. Like, you followed a blueprint someone else drew up for you. College, job, marriage, house. You check all the boxes, and you wake up one day in a house you helped design, next to a person you promised to love forever, and you feel hollow, like an imposter in your own life." He wasn't just talking about the divorce anymore. This was deeper. This was an admission of a fundamental unhappiness that predated Melissa leaving. It was a moment of shocking vulnerability. He was letting me see the cracks in the facade he had so carefully constructed for years. "I didn't realize you felt that way," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Neither did I," he confessed, a bitter twist to his lips. "Not really. I just kept busy. Kept designing, kept building. As long as I was moving, I didn't have to think about whether I was moving in the right direction." He picked at a stray piece of cheese on the pizza box. "Melissa leaving, it wasn't the earthquake. It was the aftershock. The real earthquake happened years ago, and I was just too damn scared to feel the ground shake." He fell silent, but his eyes were fixed on me, searching for something. Understanding, maybe, or absolution. He had just shown me a part of himself he'd likely never shown anyone, not even his wife. He had shown me his softness, his fear. And in that moment, sitting on a plastic drop cloth in my newly painted living room, my love for him, which had been a quiet, steady ache for years, sharpened into something fierce and overwhelming. I wanted to protect this man. I wanted to heal him. I wanted to show him what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, for who he was, not for the part he had been playing. But all I said was, "I'm sorry, Alex. I'm so sorry you went through that alone." He held my gaze for a long moment, and a flicker of something, gratitude, relief, something else I couldn't name, passed through his eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I wasn't entirely alone," he said softly. "I always had you." The words hung in the air, simple and profound. It was a confession of a different kind, an acknowledgement of a bond that ran deeper than he had ever let on. The foundation of our friendship, which I had always feared was built on my silence and his obliviousness, suddenly felt like something much more solid. Something that could, perhaps, bear the weight of what was to come. A few days later, the other shoe dropped. A large cardboard box arrived, addressed to Alex. There was no return address, but we both knew who it was from. It was a care package from the ruins of his former life. Alex stared at it as if it were a bomb. "You don't have to open it now," I said gently. "I know," he replied, his jaw tight. "But it's not going to unexist itself if I ignore it." With a deep, fortifying breath, he sliced through the packing tape with my kitchen knife. Inside was a jumble of his belongings, thrown together without care. A few books, his favorite coffee mug, a framed photo turned face down, and on top of it all, a thick, leather-bound photo album. He lifted it out, his movements slow and deliberate. It was from college, from before. He sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, and opened it. I sat beside him, a silent, supportive presence. The pages were filled with ghosts. Us, 20 years old, impossibly young, with terrible haircuts and cheap beer in our hands. There were pictures from hiking trips, late-night study sessions in the architecture studio, a disastrous attempt at building a bookshelf in our first apartment. Then he stopped on a particular page. It was a photo someone had taken of us at an outdoor concert. We were standing in a field, the sun setting behind us, casting everything in a golden light. My arm was slung around his shoulders, and his was around my waist. We were both grinning at the camera, a shared, unself-conscious joy radiating from the faded image. Our heads were close together, my cheek almost brushing his temple. I remembered that day. I remembered the feeling of his t-shirt under my arm, the warmth of his body pressed against mine. I remembered thinking, in a moment of pure, unguarded clarity, I could stay like this forever. Alex traced the outline of my face in the photograph with his thumb, his expression unreadable. "We were happy then, weren't we?" he said, his voice thick with nostalgia. "Before everything got so complicated." "We were," I agreed, my own voice tight. "We were kids. Nothing was complicated." "That's not true," he said, turning to look at me, his eyes dark and intense. "It was already complicated. I was just too stupid to see it." My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. What did he mean? What did he see now that he hadn't seen then? The air was suddenly thin, charged with unspoken history. He closed the album and set it aside, but he didn't look away from me. He just watched me, his gaze so penetrating it felt like he could see every secret I'd ever kept. That night, the tension that had been simmering between us since the day he arrived finally reached its boiling point. I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, the newly painted gray walls seeming to close in on me. I ended up in the living room, staring out the window at the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city. I heard a floorboard creak behind me and knew, without turning, that it was him. He came to stand beside me at the window. We stood in silence for a long time, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but I was aware of him with every cell in my body. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the clean, simple scent of the soap from my shower on him. "I can't stop thinking about that picture," he said finally, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "It was a long time ago," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Was it?" He turned his body to face me. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and other times it feels like a different lifetime, like it happened to two other people." He took a small step closer. "We were barely a foot apart now. Why have you never settled down, Leo? You're a good man. The best I know. Why have you always been alone?" The question was a precision strike, aimed directly at the heart of the truth I had guarded for so long. It wasn't an idle question. It was a demand. He was asking for the key to the locked room. He was asking for everything. I could lie. I could make up a story about not finding the right person, about being too focused on my career. It would be so easy to deflect, to retreat back into the safety of my platonic role. But looking into his eyes, seeing the raw honesty and the searching vulnerability there, I knew I couldn't. He had shown me his truth, his brokenness. He deserved mine in return. My throat was dry. I felt a tremor start in my hands, a mirror of the one that had shaken him on my doorstep 2 weeks ago. "I guess I was waiting," I said, the words feeling fragile and thin in the heavy air. His brow furrowed slightly. "Waiting for what?" "This is it. The precipice. I can step back, or I can jump." I take a breath. "I jump." "For you?" I said. The words were barely a whisper, but they landed between us with the force of a thunderclap. I watched his face, bracing myself for the shock, the confusion, the pity, the disgust. I was ready for him to take a step back, to put a universe of distance between us, to see our entire friendship shatter into a million irreparable pieces. But he didn't. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, his eyes wide, searching mine as if trying to decipher a language he'd just heard for the first time. The silence stretched, taut, and agonizing. I felt my entire life, my entire future, balanced on the head of this single, terrifying moment. Then, slowly, a storm of emotions seemed to pass over his face. Shock melted into dawning comprehension, which in turn gave way to something I couldn't read, something deep and tumultuous. He raised a hand, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to push me away. Instead, his fingers came to rest gently on the side of my face, his thumb stroking the line of my jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning, but it was not a rejection. "Leo," he breathed, his voice filled with a kind of wonder, a kind of sorrow. All this time, I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. I was completely exposed, my heart laid bare for him to either accept or crush. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound regret in his eyes. "God, I've been such a fool." And then he closed the small distance between us. His other hand came up to cup the other side of my face, holding me as if I were something precious, something he was afraid might break. He leaned in, and his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of grief or confusion or drunken desperation. It was a kiss of discovery. It was slow, gentle, almost tentative at first, a question he was asking and I was answering. It was a kiss that tasted of regret for lost years and the breathtaking, terrifying hope of a new beginning. I melted into it, my hands coming up to grip his wrists, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He deepened the kiss, a soft groan rumbling in his chest. It was a sound of homecoming, of a truth finally acknowledged. All the years of unspoken feelings, of longing glances and carefully censored thoughts, came pouring into that single point of contact. It wasn't just my confession, it was his, too. It was in the way his thumbs stroked my skin, the way he tilted his head to fit his mouth more perfectly against mine, the way his body sagged against me with a sigh of what felt like profound relief. This was not the act of a man on the rebound. This was the act of a man who had been walking in the wrong direction and had just, finally, found his way back to a path he hadn't even known he was looking for. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hands were still cradling my face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. "Don't be," I managed to say. "No," he said, opening his eyes. They were clear, lucid, and achingly sincere. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you. To really see you." In that moment, under the soft glow of the city lights filtering through my window, the locked room inside my chest finally swung open, and I realized it wasn't a prison. It was just a place that had been waiting for him to arrive. The morning after was a study in silence and avoidance. I woke up on my bed, fully clothed, with no memory of having gone there. The last thing I remembered was the feeling of his forehead against mine, the weight of his hands on my face. Alex was on the couch, already awake when I emerged from my room. He was sitting up, staring into a cold cup of coffee, his back ramrod straight. He didn't look at me. A cold, sickening dread washed over me. It was a mistake, a moment of emotional transference. His world had ended, and I was there, a stable, comforting presence, and he had latched onto me. The kiss wasn't a beginning. It was a symptom of his grief. I had pushed him, confessed at his most vulnerable moment, and now he was filled with regret. The shame was so intense it felt like a physical illness. I had destroyed everything. "Morning," I mumbled, my voice sticking in my throat. I moved to the kitchen, busying myself with the coffee maker, my movements jerky and awkward. I could feel his presence behind me, a heavy, silent weight. "Morning," he replied, his voice flat. We didn't speak as I made coffee. The silence was a living thing, a suffocating entity that filled my apartment. Every tick of the clock was a judgment. The familiar, comforting space of my home now felt like a minefield. I poured him a mug of coffee and placed it on the coffee table, careful not to get too close, careful not to let our fingers brush. He murmured a thank you without looking up. I retreated to my desk, pretending to check emails, my screen a meaningless blur of pixels. My mind was racing, composing 1,000 different apologies, 1,000 ways to take it all back, to rewind time to the moment before I spoke my foolish, selfish truth. I could feel him on the couch, not moving, just radiating a tense, coiled energy. This was it. This was the end. He would pack his box, thank me for my hospitality, and walk out of my life, leaving nothing but the ghost of a friendship and the smell of fresh paint. The hours crawled by. The morning bled into a gray, listless afternoon. Neither of us had moved. The tension had become unbearable, a high-pitched whine in the air. Finally, I heard the couch cushions sigh as he stood up. I held my breath, my knuckles white as I gripped my mouse. This is it. He's leaving. I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching my desk. He stopped right behind my chair. I didn't dare turn around. I just stared at my screen, my heart pounding in my ears. "Leo." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence. I closed my eyes. "Alex," I said, my own voice a weak imitation of its normal self. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, I swiveled my chair to face him. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were deeper than they had been even on the first night. But his expression wasn't one of disgust or pity. It was one of intense, painful concentration, as if he were trying to solve the world's most complex equation in his head. "I'm sorry about this morning," he began, his voice low and earnest. I was I'm not good at this. At what? I asked, my voice barely audible. This, he said, gesturing vaguely between us. Feelings. Talking. I spent 12 years learning how not to talk about what really matters. He took a deep breath. When I woke up this morning, my first thought wasn't I made a mistake. My first thought was terror. My stomach plummeted. Terror. Yes, he said, meeting my gaze directly. Because for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt something real. Something that wasn't part of the plan, part of the blueprint. And it scared the hell out of me. Because it felt important. And I have a history of breaking important things. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. It wasn't regret. It was fear. Fear I could understand. Fear I had lived with for years. He stepped closer, crouching down so he was at eye level with me in my chair. I didn't kiss you because I was grieving, Leo. I didn't kiss you because I was drunk or lonely. He paused, his eyes searching mine. I kissed you because it felt like the only honest thing I've done in a decade. He reached out and took my hand. His was warm and solid, his grip firm and reassuring. It wasn't a fleeting, accidental touch. It was a deliberate, conscious connection. I'm not running, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I promise you, I'm not running. I'm just trying to figure out how to walk toward this without falling on my face. I looked down at our joined hands, his larger one completely enveloping mine. A single tear I hadn't realized was forming escaped and rolled down my cheek. He reached up with his free hand and gently wiped it away with his thumb. It's okay to be scared, I said, finding my voice. I've been scared for 12 years. A sad smile touched his lips. Well, he said, maybe we can be scared together for a while. Just then, his phone, which had been sitting on the end table, buzzed loudly, shattering the fragile intimacy of the moment. We both looked over. The screen was lit up with a name, Melissa. I felt a jolt of pure panic. My hand instinctively tried to pull away from his, but he held on tighter. The test. Here it was. The ghost from his past, calling to pull him back. I watched his face, searching for any sign of conflict, of longing. He looked at the phone, then he looked back at me. His expression was calm, resolute. He let the phone buzz a second time, then a third. He made no move to answer it. When it finally fell silent, he squeezed my hand. That's over, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. It's been over for a long time. I just didn't have the courage to admit it. He let go of my hand, stood up, walked over to the phone, and with a few decisive taps, blocked her number. He then turned the phone off completely and set it face down on the table. He turned back to me, a look of finality on his face. No more ghosts, he said. Just us. My heart picked up pace. Just us. It was a phrase I had dreamed of, a possibility I had never truly allowed myself to believe in. He had passed the test without a moment's hesitation. He had chosen this. He had chosen me. The fear that had been my constant companion for so long began, finally, to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile, but fiercely determined hope. In the days that followed, we talked. Really talked. We dismantled the past, laying out all the unspoken truths and missed signals. He told me about the creeping loneliness in his marriage, the feeling of performing a role he'd outgrown. I told him about watching from the sidelines, about the quiet ache of loving someone who was seemingly unattainable. It was painful and messy, but it was honest. We were redrawing the map of our relationship, erasing the old boundaries of friendship and tentatively sketching in the new, uncharted territory of whatever this was becoming. A week after the kiss, Alex announced he had found an apartment, a small one-bedroom a few blocks away. My initial reaction was a sharp pang of disappointment. He was leaving, but he must have seen it on my face, because he was quick to explain. I'm not leaving you, Leo, he said, taking my hands in his. I'm leaving your couch. We can't build something new if I'm a refugee in your living room. We need a fresh start. We need dates. We need to choose to be together, not just fall together out of circumstance. He was right. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate step toward building a real relationship. It wasn't about him running away. It was about him creating a space where we could properly walk toward each other. The day he was set to move his few belongings was bittersweet. My apartment felt cavernously empty, without his presence filling the living room. The couch looked naked without his blanket thrown over it. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was just quiet. He packed his box, the one Melissa had sent, now taped back up and filled with the few things he'd accumulated. When he was done, he stood in the doorway, just as he had that first night, but he was a different man. The haunted, broken look was gone. He was still sad, still healing, but he was no longer lost. He looked steady. "So," he said a little awkwardly, "this is it." "Yeah," I said, my hands shoved in my pockets. "I'll call you," he said, "for a date. A real 1 inch. I'd like that," I smiled. He hesitated for a moment. Then he stepped forward, closed the distance between us, and gave me a soft, lingering kiss. It was gentle and full of promise. "Talk to you soon, Leo." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and I was alone again in my apartment. But something was different. The loneliness wasn't there. The space didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. It was waiting, just like I was. The final scene unfolds a few weeks later. My life has a new rhythm. It's still quiet, still orderly, but it's punctuated by the thrill of Alex's texts, the warmth of his voice on the phone, the electricity of our dates. We went for dinner. We saw a movie. We walked through the park, holding hands, a simple act that felt like a revolution. We were taking it slow, learning this new language between us. Tonight, he was coming over. Not to stay, but for dinner. A proper date, in my space. The space that had been his refuge and was now becoming our shared ground. I was cooking, something I rarely did for anyone but myself, nervously chopping vegetables while my heart did a nervous little tap dance. The doorbell rang, and this time, it didn't fill me with anxiety. It filled me with a joyful anticipation. I opened the door, and there he was. He was smiling, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small, ridiculous-looking potted plant in the other. "A housewarming gift," he said, handing me the plant. "For the new color scheme." I laughed, taking it from him. "It's perfect." He stepped inside, and his presence immediately filled the space, chasing away the last vestiges of its former solitude. He leaned in and kissed me, a deep, confident kiss that left me breathless. "Smells good in here," he murmured against my lips. "It's just pasta," I said, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "I'm sure it's amazing," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. We cooked together, moving around my small kitchen in an easy, comfortable dance. His hand would find my waist as he passed behind me. I'd lean my head on his shoulder as I stirred the sauce. It was simple, domestic, an intimacy more profound than any grand gesture. We weren't performing for anyone. We weren't pretending. We were just us. Later, we sat on my small balcony. The city lights spread out before us like a carpet of fallen stars. The air was cool, but I felt nothing but warmth. A plate of pasta was on the small table between us, a glass of wine in my hand. Alex reached across the table and took my other hand, lacing his fingers through mine. His thumb traced idle circles on my skin. I looked down at our joined hands, illuminated by the glow of the city. For so many years, I had been an observer of my own life, a passive spectator watching from a safe distance, too afraid to step onto the field. I had built my walls so high, I had almost forgotten what the sun felt like. Alex crashing into my life hadn't just broken his world, he had broken mine, too. He had shattered the quiet, lonely peace I had mistaken for contentment and had shown me what it truly meant to feel connected, to be seen. He followed my gaze to our hands. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I looked up, meeting his warm, steady gaze. The man who had shown up at my door, drenched and broken, was gone. In his place was a man who was learning to be whole again, and who was, in turn, making me whole, too. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be scars to heal, new habits to form, a lifetime of history to navigate. But for the first time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. "I was just thinking," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I'm glad you knew where I lived." He smiled back, a genuine, soul-deep smile that lit up his entire face. He squeezed my hand. "Me too, Leo," he said. "Me too." And as I sat there, his hand in mine, the city breathing all around us, I felt the last of the fear finally, truly, let go. I was no longer waiting. I was no longer watching. I was here. I was home.